Okay, well, does anyone need more time? Would you like to read more, or would you like me to run through it?
I say you walk us through it.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so this whole proposal comes from an idea that James said a couple of weeks ago, that we could have a thing that would an extra resource that would help us control cross namespace references and who can create them. So who can control, like, which persona should be able to sort of control the use of a resource in cross namespace references. So one of the things I was trying to go with here was to really make this so that A, it works like a lot of other existing Kubernetes objects with selections, and B, to sort of remove the language that we currently have around binding. At least to me, I thought the binding is kind of an operation that should succeed, whereas I think that it's much more acceptable for a selection to select an empty set than it is for an object to fail to bind. An object failing to bind is an error, and the selection of an empty set is not an error. So that's where one of the things that I went into in the terminology down there. But yeah, so in terms of the sort of broad goals is we want to have it so that whoever owns an object is the person who can control whether or not that object can be referenced across namespaces, and also whether or not that object can reference across namespaces. And then, yeah, just making that a separate resource. So I'm not 100% on the name. I sort of went backwards and forwards on a few things, but I think selection policy feels like the best option to me right now. I wanted to also be able to use this same mechanism for that we ended up the prior art with Contour's TLS certificate delegation, which allows a secret to control the owner of a secret to control where it can be referenced in other things, so that you can use a secret that you don't own. This has been really useful for Contour users to be able to control highly sensitive secrets like TLS keypads. And I think that this would be really good. Micaiah raises the point that that this is a very general proposal. As I worked on this, I felt like maybe something like this would be useful more broadly in Kubernetes, but I didn't want to go too fast. I wanted to get everyone here to have a read over it before I talked about anything. So yeah, thanks Micaiah for jumping ahead a little bit. So let's talk the actual thing. So a selection policy is an object that you put in the same namespace as an object that you want it to control. You select the object using a local selector, and you can it then has a from and a to stanza that allow you to control where references are allowed from and where references are allowed to. Let's have a look at a couple of there's a bunch of little details that are really important there, but I want to have a look at the examples first. Here is this is sort of what the most simple one I can think of. This is a selection policy that selects HTTP routes in the blog namespace and allows references from a gateway named external in the external namespace. Now the from and to stanzas have I'll show you the structs in a bit, but all of these references allow reference either directly by name or by a selector. And so in the case of the from and to ones, they are a very general reference. So they allow reference by name and namespace specifically, or by selector on either of those things. Obviously, if you have a selector and you also specify a direct reference in the same stanza, then the direct one will win. The second example I had was an outbound selection policy for gateways. This would be like a guardrails for people editing the gateway to make sure that you don't make a typo or something like that. And yeah, this one, in this case, this is the inverse of the previous one. So this is this allows the external gateway in the external namespace to make references to HTTP routes in the blog namespace.
Couple of questions. So by objects, is that the from?
So yes, that's the, no, that's not the from, that's the like owned objects of this selection policy. So the tricky part I had here was, and I think you can see it more in one of these ones down here. No, I haven't got it. So this one actually, sorry, I just realized I made a mistake. Yeah, so the HTTP route is allowing routes from gateways to the HTTP route, and the gateway selection policy is allowing routes from the gateway to the HTTP route. Now, the reason why I didn't just make these the same is that if you made it the same, then you could kind of arbitrarily select anything in the cluster to control from any namespace. By having this object stanza not have a namespace and demand that you select things in the local namespace, that helps deliver the sort of you have to own the object and and own the namespace where the object is, so you can create selection policies there.
I see. So in your examples, there's not, conceivably you could have an object that has both the from and the to.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
And I would certainly see that in the case of, say, a HTTP route that does the sort of delegation or inclusion thing that we've talked about as well.
Right.
I haven't mentioned that here, but that's sort of the other thing that I had in mind, is that, you know, if you want to be able to control where a route can, you know, include other routes from, then that's a good case for having a selection policy on HTTP route like here that has allowed references to as well as allowed references from.
I see. And then you could, and all of these are union together, I guess.
Yes.
Or what
yes,
happens?
exactly.
You create like multiple of them.
Yes, and they're just union together. They're overlaid, and if that ends up with an empty set, then it just ends up with an empty set. One of the things that has been tricky for me to think about here, and
well, that's not union. That's intersection, I guess.
Yeah, intersected is probably a better way to say it. Yes, they are.
Wait,
no,
no,
they're logically ended. So I can't remember if that's union or intersection or some combination. So the idea being that you can you can specify multiple selection policies for, you know, a single object, and that they will all apply.
So basically, it's a big if statement where you take all the policies and one by one, not literally, but one by one you evaluate it. Order doesn't matter, and it has to pass all of them.
Yep, exactly. I don't see any other way to do that with a CRD that could apply to, you know, the same thing multiple times. Unless we sort of had some sort of conflict resolution behavior, but that puts you in a different problem space. Steve Slocum asked a couple of good questions that I realized I hadn't addressed. Is this enabled by default? For same namespace references, I don't see this being enabled, right? So, I mean, I don't think there's anything to stop you creating one of these, but I think that the behavior we should insist on is that by default, you can create references among Gateway API objects within the same namespace without needing any selection policies. If you wish to create a cross namespace reference, then you must have a selection policy at the destination, at the referent end, that allows, at the very least, that allows it. I'm not 100% sold on whether or not we need to have an outbound one and an inbound one, or just an inbound one. I kind of feel like just an inbound one is like a requirement for making a cross namespace reference makes sense. And the idea here is to make it so that, you know, so that you can't just refer to a HTTP route in someone's namespace. They've got to say that it's okay that you do that. I'm sorry.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, I think I'm happy because it should not require any policies to do basic, like the hello world example.
Exactly. That was definitely one of my goals, is that you shouldn't need, this is an advanced use case object. You shouldn't need anything to do basic stuff. Agreed. So one of another point that I wanted to be quite specific about is that sorry.
I had a question. So referencing, this doesn't say what context the reference is made in. Do we see that as something that may be needed or not?
So how do
Or
you
is it implicitly assumed that the type is sufficient to kind of have the user narrow that down? I know that we only have like very few kinds of referencing,
yeah.
but
So
this is like pretty generic and it's not attached to the specific field, which it is today in the spec.
yeah. I think that's a fair call. I thought that it was probably, I did have a bit of a think about that, but I couldn't really see too many use cases for saying, you know, like you can refer to it with listeners, but not with anything else or something like that. Like once you select a kind, I feel like that's probably enough. I'm happy to be corrected there. So
So
I
it would
see.
be interesting to see, like, because this is a little bit subtle, I guess, even in just future versions of the API. Like if someone adds something that references another thing, would we run into any problems? Would it be obvious that you'd have to deal with this in some way?
That's what I feel like. I feel like the point of this is to make it so that our position on cross namespace references is you got to have a selection policy that covers a cross namespace reference between any two objects. So I mean that's sort of the general position. I mean maybe we might, if we did do the other types of policy objects that Mark and Rob are talking about, then maybe we might not want to have this, but I don't know. Maybe it's useful to have the selection policy for the policy references as well, to say, well, this policy can only be referenced by these namespaces or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was saying this is kind of complementary. Well, I guess to answer your first kind of the thing you brought up, Bowie, is like, as long as one kind of reference or one kind of resource only references another kind of resource in a single way, then this works, right?
Yeah, I think this works right now.
But if it
should
expands,
just be careful
then,
because it yeah, in the future we might have some confusion.
Because references, they just mean a lot of different things, right? Like a listener referencing to a route is kind of different than like a policy referencing to a resource to apply policy to it. So that's kind of like implied here in just like what kind of resource is referring to what other kind of resource. I would hate to make it more complex and have to like put specific field that is doing the reference in here, because that would just, I feel like, make this too complex. But yeah.
Maybe it's like too much in the future. I'm just thinking I'm trying to think of like what is the difference, because semantically they're very much the same, but that is one thing that is different between the two proposals. If anything, we should just write down the fact that we don't expect to go there, and if we did, I guess we would add another little discriminator here, like I don't know what we would call it.
Yeah, I think that it's probably relevant to just quickly show you the Go struct for the to and the from references. I tried to be, again, I was being pretty generic with the names here because I did think that maybe it might be more useful in things. So this is just an object set reference. I named it that to distinguish it from a standard object reference, which refers to things by the typed object reference, which refers to things by GVK plus name and namespace. In our case, we've got GVK plus name plus namespace plus a selector for the objects and a selector for the namespace. With the intent there being that you can refer to things either by name and namespace directly or by selector for one or the other. So you can select things from a specific namespace, but with a selector. So you could say all routes with, app equals external from the blog namespace. That's expressible with this object as it stands. And I did spend a lot of time thinking about the sort of the empty and null behaviors. So because I've made the empty and the null behavior different, I know that that's like not great, but in this case, I thought it was really relevant so that you can make the way the fields work. If you have the empty value match everything and the null value match nothing, then it means that you can, then the object works as like a increasing discriminator, as Bowie said. So the more things you specify here, the more tightly you match a specific thing.
Is that the same as the OG label selector
Yes.
behavior?
Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, the OG
All right.
label selector work. So actually, I'm not 100% sure. I need to check the exact behavior.
Yeah, it would be confusing if it's like flipped.
Yeah. So I need to check that and make sure that it is the same. But I feel like this is definitely like the most usable I could come up with, because then that means that you can do stuff like.
It might be reversed.
Is it okay? If it is, then
clear.
it is.
Yeah.
If it's the other way, then it's not the end of the world. It doesn't really matter which one we pick, but the intent being that I wanted it to be able to do something like this, where this is actually an approximation of the functionality of the TLS certificate delegation. So it selects objects that are secrets. It selects a specific name secret, and it allows references to any object in the blog namespace or any object in the API namespace. Yeah, and
so in the experience of the TLS, like people were very clear as to the fact that it would only be applicable in just a certain context.
Yep.
Or was there any people asking, hey, well, I could use this for other things that talk about secrets?
No.
Could it be? I see.
Yeah, the people weren't asking for us to make that more general. It was more just that as I was doing this, I realized that controlling that object controls how you can reference another object. And so I was like, well, it's the same problem that we're dealing with controlling how a gateway can reference a route, or controlling how a route can be referenced by a gateway as well, or how a route can reference another route for inclusion. And so that was why I sort of thought, well, and I know that people definitely want this sort of feature where you keep the for TLS secrets, people want a feature where you can keep the secure that key pair for your main company website in a place where not many people have access to, but you can say this object that describes the ingress that is on that site needs to use the key pair for the site. Say if you're
I think like
breaking out by a URL, then you need something.
It feels like this is close to sort of like that simplicity that we want. We just need to probably add like a chunk, not large, of like, hey, and in the future, if we needed to discriminate it, perhaps this is how it would go. Because basically this is like pulling out the policy from each of the different places and putting it in one place, but then the context right now is like 100% clearer because there's just only one place that the resource could possibly do references. But in the future, you could conceivably encounter a situation where the fact that it was pulled out meant that we lost that context.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I don't disagree. As I said, the point of this was to sort of raise the idea and seek feedback.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying it's finished.
Yeah, so I think like
I did the ghost structs just because that was the easiest way for me to understand how the stances would work.
Yeah, this is not like negative on the proposal. I'm just saying that we should discuss it just to understand it, and then it seems reasonable that that's okay. It's a design choice. Like, could someone recycle this in another context? Probably not. We would probably say don't do that. Could there be multiple contexts in which you want different reference policies? Look at the API. I don't think that exists today, so that would be unique. I see David has this.
Yep.
Oh man, someone used all capital letters in the okay. So Kyverno. Yeah, we also have to discuss how this interacts with like super complicated policy description. I guess in just speaking off the top of my head, like this is the minimum that we need to express just to get the API off the ground. But if you want a more complicated policy, you could probably just go and write one on top of this one.
Yep. Yeah, agreed. I think John, you got your hand up. Sorry. Feel free to go.
Yeah, one thing, like I've been trying to think how this would be used by users, and I'm a bit confused on like why we have kind of like this mix now of inline references and this separate resource. And I feel like it's really confusing because now like I have my selector and it says, hey, select route foo equals bar. And then suddenly it's not selected. And I have no idea why. And then I was, someone set up a selection policy. And now I actually have two ways to configure the selection. And I need to make sure they're both in sync, and I need to, comprehend both of them. It seems fairly complicated, especially when it's not the only way. Like it seems like we can have inline selectors like we have today, and we can have an external policy that's kind of binding routes and gateways, or in the future routes and policy objects. But to have kind of this hybrid model seems like it's a bit confusing.
I think that's pretty fair. Yeah, as I went backwards and forwards on whether to like rationalize a bit more about exactly how this worked, but one of the points that was, I feel like the rough rule I have in my head for this is that that the gateway API currently has like a descending security context, right? Like there's like an infrastructure operator, so I can't remember what the name is, but there's like the person who owns the cluster, the person who owns the gateway class, and then the person who owns the application. And so like having the references from the, this is like a way for the person who's lower down the hierarchy to sort of push back on the person who's higher up to some extent, I think. But you're right, like, it is confusing.
I have a question. So for sure you need to control references to you. This one also controls what you can reference out. Is that right?
Yeah, I put that in there because it seems straightforward, but yes, you're right. You can put controls around yourself to say you, and I see that being listed as sort of being used as guardrails. To be like, I don't want to accidentally make a typo or something like that.
I see. That one's more confusing to me towards John's point, is because are we missing, because I guess like maybe it's just a renaming, like maybe it should be called reference policy, because the thing that we're missing right now is a way to say you're referencing me and no, like don't do that, like you can't reference me. Yep. But selectors going out is already like fairly clear, I guess. Do we need another policy overlaid on top of that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. We probably don't, now that I think about it. I was probably, classic. I was deep in the thing. And I'm like, oh, why wouldn't you do it both ways? But I think that both of those points are fair. That probably makes sense to remove the two, when basically just to say allowed.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, did you have a use case in the TLS or any of the existing stuff for two?
No. So I was actually initially using the two because it's like a reference. It's a reference to the secret, but I think John made the point that like this is it should be that the secret is allowed to be referred from namespaces. And so you're right that there's no real reason why this needs a two. We could just take the two out and just have the allowed references is inbound references only, and that would make this much simpler to understand. And so in that case, John, to answer your earlier question, it seems like the rule would be this is like I think James suggested to me out of band, the reference policy might be a better name. I think that's probably good. But then this is a thing to control what for the owner of an object to control what may reference them. And so it's a reference policy, and it says for these objects only the things that I say may reference them. And so that means that then the difference between the binding that's the thing that's on a gateway is that it's selecting objects, and then the route is the reference policy allows you to remove your thing from selection. Is that
Yeah,
clearer?
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but wait, isn't the two? Don't we need the two as well for gateway API case? Because you have selections in both directions, right? You have a gateway selecting routes, and you have a route selecting gateways. And part of this is we want to get rid of like this kind of bidirectional handshake.
Yes, and so sorry, one thing that I didn't mention much was that as part of this, looking at the current stanza that's on the routes, that that stanza, all it does is the same is this functionality, right? Like really, the selection that you have on routes is saying this route can be used by these gateways because the use flows from the gateway down to the route, right? And so the route using the gateway is not really correct because a route doesn't do anything without a gateway. And so it's the gateway that must select the route, and then the route can say, no, I should not be selected by you. Is what this policy is, what this thing is going for. It's not right now we have it as a bidirectional selection because that's the hammer that we had, right? But I don't think that that's really what we're doing. Does that make sense?
So when you install by default, so I'm assuming that if you don't have one of these, then the selection policy is same namespace, I guess, implicitly.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then if let's say you had a gateway and it said it selected all namespaces, and then some other user came along and just created a route, so then that's fine because the gateway wouldn't be allowed to select that one. And then the route owner would have to explicitly create a policy in order to attach themselves.
Yes, definitely. Okay. And so that is definitely an example I should put in there to say this is how we see the flow working for for that sort of use case. Is that you as the route owner have to opt into being included into a gateway. If you want to say my route can be included in any gateway that wants me, then you can create a selection policy that will say that, but that is indicating your intent. And so the cross namespace references does not work unless you as the route owner opt into having it work. That's the thing that I like about this idea. John, you still have your hand up. Did you need to talk again?
No, sorry, still hand.
No worries, it's fine. Eventual hand consistency.
Which parts of the existing gateway and route referencing is this replacing? Is it effectively all of it? Like there are no more references in the gateway and the route?
No, the gateway will still select routes, and I had a look at using the same struct that I use here, but it doesn't work because it has the. I spent a little bit of time looking at it, but I wasn't 100% sure. I wanted to get people's feedback before I went back and went too far into it. What I think we should do is, if we decide to do this, we reevaluate the gateway selection, like the actual stanza that we use for selection, because I think some of the stuff about same namespace and all that sort of stuff may be redundant with this, but it depends on the exact behavior we define here. But the stanza that we have on the routes that allows it to select a gateway is redundant once we have this, and we can remove that.
Yeah, I think that one is like exactly this, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's if
you think of the things as a hierarchy with the gateway sort of referring to the routes, and in the case that we do inclusion, then routes referring to routes. In each case, the downward one is a selection that is a stanza inside an object, but the upward one is this reference policy that allows the downward object to sort of say, no, I don't want to be part of your shenanigans. And so in places where we have other things like that, we can also use this. And one thing I didn't have time to put in here was that we could have it be that one thing that I did consider originally was violating that a little bit and making it be that gateway classes could have some method to say that only certain gateways could be there. But I think that in this way, it would actually be less confusing rather than using this, the reference policy on the gateway class, since it's not namespaced, to have that just be a thing in the gateway class. That if you wanted to make it so that you can cut it down and say only certain gateways can use this, then that should be a spec item inside the gateway class.
Yeah, I think you could have a cluster reference policy thingy to address that one. We would run into the same, like we just said, oh, OPA ...
Gatekeeper solves all problems, right?
Yeah.
And so I mean, like, one of the things that I like about this is it allows you to get, if we mandate that controllers do this, then it gives you like a fair chunk of the functionality that you would want from a set of gatekeeper templates for the gateway API, but like mandates it as part of the thing. The thing that I really
I do like it because there's like, it's like, oh, it's possible, have fun kind of design where the user's just left with like, okay, then like what's next? Versus this, which seems to be more aligned with UX.
And so the thing that I like about this is that it puts it sort of puts the control of cross namespace references solely in the control of the person who is being referenced, the referent. And I think that has been a general problem for Kubernetes for a while. And so, like, I'm not going to lie, after I'd been thinking about this for a while, I sort of thought, oh, hang on, like, if this works well here, like, I would probably want to take this to API machine and be like, what do you think? But I want to see if it works here first.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, and we don't have to block on getting resolution from API machinery because that'll be in Kubernetes, who knows what version, if it moves through there. So this allows us to go into sort of and spike out this thing, and then if we do end up taking it to API machinery, then we can say, well, hey, we did it in Gateway API and it worked like this. So I guess I feel like we sort of explained a fair chunk of it. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
It does make one kind of common use case a little bit more difficult. So where you have a very self-service model, and you have several gateways available, like shared gateways available to use, right? And so this is a pattern that's like like Cloud Run or something, or like they have it where they have like an internal one and an external one, and they're both available to use. Like in this case, it would require both the service owner would have to create a selection policy and a route, right?
Yes, they would, yes.
Mark, wouldn't they have to do that? They would basically have to embed very similar thing inside their route.
Yeah, I mean, basically the way that they would do it today is they would just put the gateway label reference on the route to specify which gateway they want to use.
I see. By dint of no, but wouldn't they have to explicitly say they were selectable? I forget.
No, not today.
So I guess
that's like a default open, default closed kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and the reason that I wanted to default this to closed was just because of the cases where the people who don't want it to be closed really, who want it to be closed really need it to be closed by default. In the case that you're talking about, Mark, like one of the things that I wanted to, and the reason I was a bit picky about the matching behavior was that I wanted you to be able to create a wide open selection policy that says, like, any route in this namespace, you can use it from wherever, I don't care. And so, I mean, I agree that having to create that for this sort of really relatively basic use case kind of sucks, but I don't see any other way unless you have some sort of Boolean in the gateway, which then makes the implementation ridiculously hard to understand. I think if there's some way that you can flip the polarity, that feels worse to me than having just one way to do it and you create an object that says, no, it's okay, I don't care. Because then the person who owns the namespace is specifically saying, I don't care where my routes are used.
Yeah, I don't know. It felt like some of the early feedback was that if there was nothing on the route that indicated which gateway it would match with, that people would not, whoever is deploying the route would not assume that they would be bound with a gateway, or they would not even know that they would be bound with a gateway, and they could be, right, as long as it exists in the same namespace.
So
I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think what I'm trying to do with this is to make it so that to bind your route to a gateway, you've got to do something, right? Like unless it's in the same namespace and you control both of them, then you have to do something to say that you want to do that. I mean, and
Yeah,
maybe
Mark, I'm looking at the API and it says that it defaults to from list. So you'd have to explicitly say all.
Yeah.
Which is like, it would, I don't know if how many people would actually use all in production, because that one just sounds scary.
Agreed. I mean, one of the good things about having routes be able to choose any gateway is that it means that you can move gateways around really easily. Like you can provision a new gateway, check that routes sort of showed up on the new gateway, and then deprovision the old one at an infrastructure level without the owners really ever knowing or caring. I mean, there's other ways to do that when you're selecting them as well, but like that would be the thing that I would want, is if you're going to churn through gateways a lot for some reason, then that would be a nice way for the application owners not to have to care too much. Are there risks to that aside from that? Absolutely. In the same way that there is for any of this stuff.
So think of, like, Mark, for your case, the Helm chart that let's say they use Helm, like it would just include this just like a blank policy that selects the internal as part of their boot up package.
Yeah, makes sense. It's just, I mean, we're taking the exact same thing that used to be in the route and putting
Exactly,
it.
There's also a nice benefit, which is that the route type no longer needs to have this duplicate thing for every protocol kind, which is an advantage.
And the other thing that I like about this is that we don't have to mutate the route type again if we do inclusion, or like a route to route reference. We don't have to have then another special stanza in there to control the to control whether routes can be referenced by other routes. You have again in the route to route case, you have a selector that selects routes that should be referenced, but then the person who's being selected, who's being the referent, is allowed to say no. Now, one thing that is very open in this design at the moment is how you reflect all of this stuff in status. Do you even reflect this stuff in status? I think it's, to some extent, it feels reasonable to me that if you select a set of things and then one of the things is for some reason not eligible, you as the selector might want to know, select all might want to know about it, but the other side of that is that we need to control that really carefully to make sure that you don't end up with like spurious references to all sorts of shenanigans. So if you did select all routes from your gateway, and then a bunch of them were not relevant, do you care? Probably not. So exactly how the status updating works seems very, very intimately tied to really small details of exactly how the policy works.
Yeah, I see this an interesting way. Like, how would you debug this? Because it's kind of like firewall rules. Like, let's say you had a gateway and it had an open selector, and then everyone had like denied policies. Like, clearly, if you just said, okay, log every single denied thing, then you'll just get this giant list of everyone, and that just seems pretty overwhelming. On the other hand, you probably want to know that a particular policy was denying you to get access to a given route.
Yeah, and so I'm not 100% sure about that. That definitely needs more thought as part of making this a real proposal. There needs to be a good sort of walkthrough of the flow of how troubleshooting this would work.
Yeah.
That is 100% not included at the moment by design, because I just, until the details are nailed down, there's too many things to think about. And so I wanted to nail down the details of the behavior first, so that then I can think about the status design.
Although I don't think it's addressed in either case. So probably this is just like a pre-existing condition. Like this didn't make it worse. It's just
No, agreed. Yeah. This
Yeah.
hasn't made it worse. No, it doesn't. This, and if anything, thinking about it is probably going to make the whole setup, the troubleshooting thing better. Yeah. So I'm interested in thoughts from other people too. Okay, you're on mute.
I'm curious. I wonder if this came up when we were talking about in the gateway API, the way a route can refer to a gateway. I'm wondering for the migration use case, it seems like the problem is you let the user reference a gateway by name, whereas really you want to allow the user to reference by a label so that if you do need to migrate from one gateway to another, you just add the label you were using on the old gateway to the new gateway. Is that something we talked about before in the context of route gateway selectors?
So the route selector definitely has the ability to do that right now, but it's not. I think you need to change some things around to do it. Again, the reason why I designed this object set reference, although I guess really should be called typed object set reference, but is that you can use a selector for either name the object themselves or namespace, as well as the name and namespace. With the intent being that you can do exactly that. That it's then kind of up to the user. I agree that it's probably better practice to do it via a label, but that doesn't feel like something we can really mandate in the API to me.
Yeah, we had discussions with people and they wanted both in different situations. Like some people wanted to be able to audit a list of things. And then of course you have that migration use case, in which case they didn't want to be involved and they'll just use a label.
Yeah, exactly. So that was why I thought it's probably better to allow the specific one, and maybe we just note that hey, if you want to be able to migrate things, having this be a selector is probably makes some cases easier.
Yeah, maybe as strongly as possible encourage people to use selectors.
Yeah.
Knowing that some people can't, but for people who don't specifically need to reference things by name, encourage them. You may not be thinking of this now, but at some point you may want to migrate, and then you'll be in a bad position if you decided to reference things by name.
We actually, all the public docs right now, so they all use the label selector, and at least amongst our users, that's what we've been seeing them do. Kind of what's in the doc is what ends up being the example that everyone does anyways.
I agree that that's a nice way to strongly indicate to people. I mean, we can put something in there as well to say, unless you have a really specific reason, you should do this with label selectors. Yeah, but it's a fair point. Okay.
So I was actually thinking of this proposal as if it was that these resources were more like administrative resources, so that like the gateway selection exists in the route, and the administrative resource, like the selection policy, exists to basically accept or reject that.
Right. So you were thinking of it as basically the other way around.
Yeah, there's another layer on top.
Yeah.
So related to that, I've been wondering, when you use terms like policy and allow, are you framing this as a security feature? So for example, if an implementation had some conformance issue, could that constitute a CVE?
I think yes. So there's something else that I don't know if it's public. Anyways, yes, it could conceivably be a CVE.
Yeah. So
this is a lot like.
Sorry, you go.
Well, this is a lot like our back then, except instead of subjects being users or groups or security service accounts, whatever, subjects are objects.
It is a bit like that.
Yes, and namespaces.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I agree.
So is this something
functionally like that? Yeah.
Is this something that should be handled by implementations, or would it be better to have an admission plugin that prohibits creating these references if no reference policy allows it?
I think the difficulty there is that the multi-resource admission policy is like a big no-no. It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I think the reason to put this on the people who are doing the implementation is that it feels cleaner to me rather than it feels cleaner to me to have the thing that's doing it just sort of basically it's like an extra filter. When you're doing the reference, when you're actually calculating the references, you calculate you have a cache of all of these policies, whether we call it reference policy, sure. And when you're referring to an object, you then just run through you go through your cache and say, does anything exclude, does any reference policy exclude that reference? And that it feels like it would be reasonably clean to implement that in that way. I think if you do anything, in my ideal world, I think that at the end of the day, we would have this done by an API server, right? Like this object would be an API server object, would be a core object, and it would control any cross namespace reference between any two objects. And in that case, then it would just be done by the API server for you, right? Like, or something like that. But
Well,
even in that,
I think like it definitely has security implications just because of, well, one, traffic for routes, but even if you ignore that, like if you use this for TLS for sure, that's 100% security sensitive.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, I think it comes down to the Kubernetes has like a namespace based security model, right? Like it's not yes, namespace and resource, but like the largest surface area that most people see for like access control and things like that is on a per namespace basis. And so having something that helps you work with cross namespace references seems to really fit well with that.
The thing that concerns me is we're talking about this is a security mechanism, and we're saying here's an API, and every implementer has to implement it properly and not get it wrong, otherwise, CVE. I wonder if maybe we could, as a middle ground, have a library package or something like subject access reviews, where you can submit an SAR for RBAC to see what RBAC allows or doesn't allow. Maybe something similar for selection policy.
That seems pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah, I think like to make this successful, I know that we discussed a kubectl plugin, which seems like probably like, it sounds like given how CRD support is going, probably is like required. In that like for debugging of these accesses, it feels like it would have to live in that plugin, and then for that to actually be successful, it has to be that all implementations kind of have a similar behavior.
And the best
probably
way to do that
won't cut it.
Yeah, and the best way to do that is to have it be a common package or a library. Agreed. So yeah, I guess we're almost out of time. I think we've heard from pretty much everyone except for Dane. Do you have anything? You've done far more work than me on actually implementing all this stuff. How do you feel about it?
No, I think this is a good breakdown. It's definitely an interesting concept, as Micaiah mentioned earlier. I think it's applicable beyond Gateway API. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of feedback you get from what is it, the API machinery or whatever group that you would kind of take this to get greater feedback. I think what I've shared with you and what we've discussed in the past is, just the additional CRD is, for the simple use cases, maybe that's
Yeah, and that was why I wanted to make it. That was definitely a thing I was thinking about, and that was why I made it so that for the simplest use case, for the everything in the same namespace use case, you do not need to touch this. And I think that should be a really strong rule that for the for the hello world use case, you don't need to use this object at all. And as long as everything is in the same namespace, then by default everything will work. It just means that we need to carefully construct the exact behavior and the expectations around how all of this stuff works, and make sure that all of that is documented very carefully. Okay.
Yeah, that's key.
So yeah, it feels like my to-dos from here are review how the current label selector works, and how the current object references works, and see if it's and see what the empty and null behaviors are. And just make sure that everything here lines up. To remove the to stanza, and just have it be essentially you select the objects that the policy applies to and the references that are allowed to it. So where things may refer to it from, and can I get any thoughts on names? It feels like maybe reference policy might be a clearer name just to go with for the next iteration.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and yeah, that sounds great. And also just if we could add to the discussion of like, yeah, we understand it's removal from the context, but that's okay because ...
Yep. And discussion of the happy path, and discussion of the troubleshooting part too. Or at least saying, I'm specifically not discussing exactly how the troubleshooting would work yet, because we need to get more of the design done or something. But it should just mention that we've discussed that. That feels like everything we've discussed so far. I will add that to the meeting notes, to the agenda. Sort of add the sort of broad feedback immediately. But with that, I think we're 3 minutes over. So unless anyone else has anything else they need to say, then I can finish it up there.
Okay, cool. Excited to see the proposal.
Excellent. And so Bowie, feels like it looks like your GEP thing is almost at a place where it's ready to go. So I'd be happy for this to be one of the first ones to go if your policy PR gets merged.
Yeah. The one note about the GEP, I think not too many people on this call, so I'll announce it again next time, is the idea is for it to just kind of preserve information, because I know that updating and the whole workflow with Git is like quite awful for feedback. So it's okay that you keep it in the doc form for now. We just do it at the very end when we kind of commit it.
Yeah, and so before we say yes, this is decided, then we take whatever's in this doc and basically turn it into a GEP. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm happy for this. If this does go ahead, then I'm happy for this to be the first thing. But it goes through.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Okay, everyone. Thanks very much. Thank you very much for listening to this proposal. Really appreciate your time, and I will talk to you all soon. Cheers.
All right.
Bye.
You good?
Thanks.